Hi, folks. You're with Tacit, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about. I lost my train of thought. What am I talking? Yes, the decline of empires. Now, do empires have a habit of hanging on to a certain way of doing business, something that served them very well for many years, hundreds of years, several hundred years, and times have changed, the situation has changed, circumstances have changed, things around them have changed, but they can't get out of that way of doing things, that way of doing things that served them so well and made them so rich and so powerful in the past. So as the circumstances around them change, maybe slowly, and they don't see it, so it's sort of an insidious, slow-moving type train, but sure, there are people around that are sort of noticing it and saying, hey, we've got to do something. But the people with the most power and the most money, the most prestige, the most say, they're the ones that are most supportive of the way it was once done, or the way it is done and was done. And therefore, they want to continue. And by the time they realize that it's all over, then it's too late. And the corrective action that could have been taken relatively painlessly earlier on is no longer taken. This is, by the way, is one of the great things about capitalism. Not that it's a great and wonderful and just system in itself, but by force of failure and loss of profits and loss of business success, people are forced to change their behavior, to do things differently. And that creates a natural level of adaptability to new situations, unlike, say, the communist or socialist system, which was far slower to adapt and far more reluctant to give up loss-making ventures and unsuccessful ventures, unproductive ventures, and so on. So I just want to have a look at a couple of things. Now, going back to ancient Greece, the Spartans had been the dominant military force in Greece for, well, hundreds of years. Now, they had a slave class called the helots, and who were doing all the, looking after the crops and maintaining the buildings and things like that. And so the Spartans could have a dedicated standing army. And these guys were quite well trained and hardened to endure great privations. And so in terms of sort of fitness and training, they were really the best Greece had to offer at the time. Now, the other city-states in Greece, they had armies too, but they were the standing army was tiny typically. The most, well, even there, you had sort of the equivalent of like the sergeant majors and the specialists, but only a small number of them. And if they wanted to rustle up an army, they had to really get the people off the fields and the farmers and the citizenry and just get them together and say, okay, give them a bit of rudimentary training and off you go. So these armies were typically no match for the Spartans, and they would lose and were reluctant, to the point where nearly all the city-states, they just thought, no, it's not worth fighting these guys on a pitched battle. Guerrilla warfare, those sorts of things, sure, but pitched battle, no chance. And that was probably a decent assessment of the reality of things. The Spartans were viewed as and were seen as close to invincible. Now, in the city of Thebes, there was a guy who, and by the way, the way battles have been fought, the structure of it, you have 3 echelons, if you like, in line of 20 guys across. For example, 20 guys across, 10 guys deep with their shields and their spears and everything. You had 3 groups of those, and they just walk forward to another group of about the same size. Then the shields would sort of clash, and then they'd try and stab each other with spears. But the Spartans would nearly always win this, just fitter and better trained, that sort of thing. And so that's how it was done. It'd been done that way for hundreds of years. Now, everyone was set in their ways that was how it was done. There wasn't another way, and no one thought of another way until this general in the city of Thebes came along called Epaminondas. And he thought, okay, why don't we do things differently? Why don't I make why don't I put these echelons, instead of in line and just walking forward and banging shields with the other dudes, why don't I put, instead of 20 shields on the left side, I'll put, for example, 40 shields deep. So with that many guys, I know I can beat the opposing Spartan force of 20 shields. But in an oblique formation, say, like a 45-degree angle, if you can imagine that, he's got the next echelon of Theban soldiers is maybe 5 shields deep, and then the last one is 2 shields deep in that 45-degree angle. So by the time that the 40 shield deep guys have routed the 20 shields deep echelon opposing them on the left side, they're now starting to come around the back of the other 2 Spartan echelons. So the Spartan echelons are actually got guys in the back of them. Now the Greek concept of courage was you had armor at the front to do the fighting, but you had no armor at the back. So the idea was if you're trying to turn tail and run, you would then expose your unprotected back to getting stabbed or cut with a sword or something like that. So this was meant to be a deterrent for, as the Greeks saw it, for cowardice at the time. Now, so Epaminondas has got these his 40 shields deep. They've scattered the Spartans of 20 shields deep on the other side, which you'd expect. Some guys are off chasing them and hacking at them. But the rest of that group then come around and attack the Spartans from the back on their other 2 echelon, on their other 2 groups there. So the Spartans have now, even though the shields at the 45-degree angle are coming towards, they're only 5 deep, and the Spartans are 20 deep opposing them, because Epaminondas has put all the heavy weight on his left side. The Spartans are now surrounded. They got dudes hacking them from the back and folks at the front. So the Spartans are routed and beaten at the Battle of Leuctra. And Epaminondas had really revolutionized phalanx, as it was called, phalanx warfare at the time, and this was a huge revolution. For hundreds of years, it was done the one way. Now it's done differently, and Epaminondas was the one that sort of threw the dice on that to go. But bear in mind, a lot of the people around were saying, "No, don't do this. It's too risky. It's going to bring disaster upon us." But Epaminondas, correctly saw it through. And so, for the first time in forever, the Spartans had been defeated on the battlefield by an army, by the way, that was nowhere near as professional as the Spartans. Soldier for soldier, the Thebans were still no match for the Spartans, but because Epaminondas had rethought the battlefield tactics, then it changed it. Now, at this point, the Spartans have, again, they've been dominant for a long time. So at this point, the Spartans have to, they can adjust their tactics. There's no reason why they can't make adjustments and go, okay, well, the reality on the ground has changed. We need to adapt our battle tactics to match it. But instead, the Spartans don't do that. They said, well, the way we've been doing it has worked well for 200 plus years. We've been kicking ass the length and breadth of Greece, forever. Why should we change? It served us well. It's brought us, it made us the dominant military power in Greece. Why the fuck should we change anything? Let's keep on going the way we are and the way we have, and that's good enough. So the Spartans sort of backed up for another few key battles, and got hammered, again, and beaten decisively, because they couldn't change. They were just looking at, no, whatever has served us will continue to serve us well. We're not going to change. We're not going to adapt. We're not going to adjust our situation to the circumstance we see before us. Now, and from that moment on, Sparta was no longer the heavy hitters in Greece. They were, Thebes became the ascendant power in Greece, and nor could the Spartans ever get their shit together to actually beat the Thebans, or to recover at least their ascendancy. Now, Sparta, the population of Sparta wasn't that big, so when they took substantial battlefield losses, which they rarely did, but when they did, they couldn't replace them quickly. As soon as they were not only getting defeats but taking heavy losses, which they used to not happen to them, they lost both ways. They could no longer field a substantial army after a few defeats, and of course they could no longer adjust their battle tactics. Now this seems crazy. You say, well, gee, if Epaminondas has rewritten the rule books on battle, wouldn't you adjust? I mean, it's hardly rocket science here. Of course you would adjust, but no, they couldn't. They stuck doggedly to what had worked for them in the past, but was no longer relevant. I mean, whether you consider this as evolution or an example of evolution in real time is another matter. But they just couldn't adapt to it or change their battle tactics and their their military structure. So that was the end of it. Now that sort of thing isn't sort of unusual. Let's have a look at the the British Empire, which is probably the most documented decline of any empire in history, and because it's in modern history, there's just volumes of data about it. But even with the volumes of data and it being quite recent, there is still a lot of discussion out there, a lot of division, a lot of disagreement over what really caused the fall of the British Empire, particularly so quickly. It went from being number one to being nowhere near number one in less than 50 years. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, that's like really swift. But let's have a look at that and see if the seeds of decline were actually planted well before they had the wars with Germany in 1914 and 1939. Now, the British had relied sort of quite heavily on a model that really had been sort of put in place in the 1820s, I guess, even earlier than that. They'd acquired or developed a mercantile empire of some size with a large navy accessing raw materials from all around the world, their colonies and that sort of thing, investing in various ventures overseas outside of Britain. The American railway system, for example, was a lot of it was funded by British investors. Now, as soon as the American Civil War was over, British money was pouring into the railways and all sorts of other infrastructure like ports and so on. So the British were actually paying to develop one of their major and premier competitors in the commercial and industrial space. Now, the British had an idea of, this was their concept or their model, a vast merchant fleet. We provide services in terms of insurance and shipping and all that sort of stuff. They had a very large manufacturing centre. A lot of this was really not far off cottage industry size. There were some decent sized enterprises, but there also were a lot of really smaller tool shops that were making things. So the British had this vast empire and this huge navy which could bring raw materials in. So they were accessing raw materials at a cheap price. So their model was get raw materials at a cheap price. A lot of the growing wheat in Canada and beef farming and sheep farming and wool farming in Australia and New Zealand, this was all paid for by British investment. So they would then bring these raw materials to Britain, cotton out of India or whatever, bring the raw materials to Britain. They would manufacture, which they could do efficiently there, and certainly in the early stage of the Industrial Revolution. And then they would produce yards of cotton and all sorts of things. So they would then sell those goods, those finished goods, around Europe and into back to the colonies, for example. Like all the finished goods in Australia and Canada in the earlier days, at least, were all British manufactured. So, and we're talking steam engine type level technology at the time. So this was a model that the British set up, which made them very, very rich, very powerful, and very influential. And they were able to afford a very large navy that could, they had battle fleets and all over the world in just about every ocean, and could exert all sorts of influence that other nations could only dream of. So this was very much the British thing. Now, there's a few things were happening sort of probably from, say, late 1860s onwards, where the game was changing, and there are a few moving parts to that, so I'll talk about it. Firstly, with the end of the American Civil War, and northern industrialization had gone apace during the Civil War, and also German unification. these were, big boosts to industrial and technical development in both the US and Germany. Now, the British had this view of free trade because they figured they had the advantage in their merchant navy, the size of their industrial sector, that they could produce goods at very competitive prices because they could access the raw materials at such competitive prices. Because of that, they stuck to the system that they had and had been in place since the 1820s or even earlier than that. So. And back in sort of the early 1800s, for example, British goods were considered to be the best made, the cheapest, as in cost benefit type ratios, the best made, the most affordable finished goods that you could get anywhere in the world. So such was the even you look at guys like George Washington, all the American elite, even after the War of Independence, they were still buying all their finished goods or most of it from England. And George Washington had his buying agent in England. He'd send them a letter saying that he wanted to buy this or that, which could be anything from clothing to anything else, really, shoes, you name it. So Britain was the workshop of the world, and it was deemed so at the time. Good quality goods at an affordable price. So that was our model. Now this was starting to change. There were newer technologies coming along in the 1860s and 70s. We're talking about chemicals, dyes, fertilizers, precision engineered steel, optics, things like camera lenses and all sorts of stuff like that. The early days of electricity and gas usage and so on. Now, it wasn't that the British didn't start embracing some of these; they did, but they just moved a lot more slowly than the Americans and the Germans did. They still thought, well, everything's fine. We're doing okay. What's the problem? Why should we go into these risky new technologies when we're doing all right? Now, the Germans and the Americans sort of went with these new technologies for a variety of reasons, and did rather well with them. Things like Edison, the light bulb, and all that sort of stuff was sort of in the works and coming along, and. So the British just didn't jump on that bandwagon. The second thing was the Americans and the Germans and the Germans did very well here. They made a decision to put up fairly high tariffs to stop British goods from coming in, or to reduce the amount of British goods to make their own manufactured local products more competitive. Now, what a lot of companies and countries do when they get that sort of help is that they think, well, shit, we can make shoddy crap products. We can inflate the price because we're protected by tariffs. We can inflate the price, make a lot of money, but produce nothing of real value or worth. We don't have to be competitive anymore. We can produce shit products and make a lot of money because we're protected by tariffs. Now, the Germans and the Americans just didn't do that. Most places do, or not most, but all. I'd say most places do. They hide behind tariffs as a way of being inefficient, ineffective, bloated, useless, lazy, incompetent, and so on. But the Germans particularly didn't do that. They produced set about producing the best quality goods, the highest quality goods, precision engineered goods, your machine tools, all sorts of things, at affordable prices, and they were able to build up those industries and achieve economies of scale, surpassing anything the British were really doing at the time. And they were able to do this behind tariff walls, so that when they started to bring the tariffs down because they didn't need them anymore, they had very competitive products. But even while they had the tariffs up, the British couldn't sell finished goods to Germany because the tariffs were too high. But the British didn't put tariffs on German goods or American goods. So American and German products could flood into Britain, and they were, of course, better quality products, particularly in the newer technologies. So this caused, again, the British to lose momentum in what would have been the key industries, such as chemicals and fertilizers and particularly things like precision engineered steel. So the British were falling quite a way behind, really, on that in the early 1900s. If you look at, say, the German field cannons, like the howitzers in World War I, they had an excellent interchangeability of parts because the precision engineered, down to the micron steel. So no matter which factory it was made in, they would produce goods that could be, they would produce steel components that could be interchanged. So if there was any maintenance issues in the field, this gun, this howitzer, the wheel had fallen off, but there's another one, the breech loader was damaged. You could move parts around. The British, in most cases, couldn't do that. Sure, it was only a few microns difference, but in precision technical goods, engineered products, a few microns, you might as well be a million miles out. You can't use that same part, or you can't interchange the parts. And this wasn't really rectified until the latter part of the war, in World War One. And it surprised me it took so long for the British to get their standardized weights and measures and things like that going. I don't know why it took that long. But to them, if it was near enough, if it was the same factory, you could interchange. But the factory down the road would just be a few microns different from the factory up around the corner. So this meant in the field you didn't have that universal interchangeability, which the Germans did have. Now another example of this was when the Americans started producing pistols, handguns, which were a big deal in the United States, but not so much in Britain. So a salesman from, I think it was Colt or one of those, came over to Britain, and he was talking to some buying group there about how all the parts were interchangeable, and he said, well, look, I can disassemble six pistols into parts. I can put them in a box. I can jiggle them around. You guys jiggle them around. You move them around, anything like, and I can reassemble six pistols, randomly picking up any part out of that box. And they were unconvinced. Oh yeah, sure you can. You're right. So he did exactly that, and he invited them to jumble around, which they did. And then he did put six pistols together, from those parts, the disassembled pistols, put six pistols together, and the British audience reward was, holy shit, how did you do that? Because the British weren't going down that same path of precision engineered quality. So the British weren't moving along with the latest technology. They were in some areas. When it came to naval ships on the water and designs and the technology there, they were still quite particular. But in the commercial arena outside of that, they didn't seem to. There's certainly, if you read the newspapers and the articles and the government utterances, political utterances of the day, they were like, oh yeah, we're still doing well. We're still the richest country in the world. We still 50% of all the ships on the water are British ships. So what's your problem? Why do we have to stress ourselves out over this new bullshit about electricity or something? So this was very much the seeds for the British Empire's decline were already there. And it's a relative as much as an absolute thing that the Germans and the Americans were moving ahead at a faster rate. And because Britain had such a huge head start, that sort of falling behind effect wasn't obvious. The relative to the Germans and the Americans, the British were like falling behind by 1% a year, for example. So it's happening very slowly. It's a bit of a slow motion thing, and in no way is it obvious. At the same time, as they were falling behind technically, of course, they've still got this free trade thing going on, so that there's no tariffs against British and American goods, German and American goods coming into Britain, but British goods are being prevented from going to America and Germany. So, and as a second aside here, this means that the British didn't develop the huge factories that the Germans and the Americans did to achieve the sort of economies of scale that along the lines of the Henry Fords and the Krupp works and those sorts of things. So they didn't achieve that same level of economies of scale in their production and so on. So they were relying again on the formula: cheap raw materials from colonies and so on. The manufacturing in England, which was no longer cutting edge anymore. So they weren't replacing their lathes and turning machines and all this, so that the machine tools, they weren't changing those to the latest technology that the Germans and the Americans were. So so Britain was falling behind on a relative, and then into the by the early 1900s was falling behind on an absolute basis. Germany was economically and technically quite a bit more powerful than the entire British Empire put together by by 1914. And so the other sort of aspect of this was the British population. The German population was double what the British, or almost double what the British population was, and the Americans, 2.5 times what the British population was, which gave them a home market with an economic mass that was substantially greater. So this was part of the British decline. So that when the wars came along, Britain really wasn't top dog anymore, and wasn't economically and technically and organisationally up to fighting a slick outfit like the Germans were in 1914, and indeed again in 1939. So this was now the British stuck to that economic trading model, the free trade, the lack of investment in. They would even be prepared to invest in an American electrical factory rather than doing it in or invest in American electronics, for example, than they would be to invest in it in Britain. And this seems rather strange, and suggests that the international sort of investor class in Britain were hardly nationalistic in that sense. Why should we produce jobs for peasants in England when we can get a better return for investments in the United States, because there's a bigger market there, and so on and so forth. So there were a number of forces that were coming together, but the British stuck to that trading model, even though it was directly causing them to fall behind. And by the way, if you read the newspaper articles, particularly sort of around 1905 to 1910, there's a lot of commentary and editorial in some of these newspapers at the time that are pointing this out, saying why are we allowing the Germans to have tariffs against our finished goods, whereas we don't put tariffs against theirs? Why are we not investing in these newer technologies? Why are we not doing so? So it wasn't that the people weren't talking about it, but the political and business and banking establishment thought, no problem, we're doing all right. Screw those guys. And so the corrective action that could have been taken, and quite easily could have been taken back in the day, never was. Similarly, because their industries in those areas, the newer technologies, were quite small, they were disproportionately used, say, for things like the Navy or the government, but not turned into consumer goods. So these factories weren't producing goods that were efficiently priced, or even efficiently made, for that matter, so that the cost of putting ships on the water was much higher than it needed to be, because these industries were not developed. And this in turn caused the British to hesitate over some of the newer technologies that they could have deployed and didn't, which then made them less able to prosecute the war in 1914. So these multiple causes were coming together. Now, had the British invested in new industries, put up tariffs against anyone that put up tariffs against them, it would have been a completely different story, but they didn't. Their commitment to an old trading model of raw materials from the colonies to the manufacturing, that was a model they stuck with doggedly when it no longer applied. The new economy was value add. That was, and the Germans and the Americans were going down that path, and the British were much slower to go down that path in the scale that they needed to. So they well, no, we don't do the value add. We can get these cheap raw materials from like Australia or Canada or something. So we don't need to take these steps. But actually, they did, and they didn't realise the extent to which they were falling behind. When empire and all that sort of stuff became out of fashion, which it did, very very much so, after 1918 and just universally so after 1945, that access to raw materials at a cheap price that no one else could get hold of was lost to the British. So they lost their advantage there almost completely. And this was a huge body blow to the British economy. But then when the European Economic Community was set up, then that blocked British finished goods from being sold in Europe. So that was another whammy that hit them. So they're being hit from all sides, but really they were just too slow to adapt to the changing circumstances. That was an example of an empire in decline. So if we look at the decline of empires, there are moral issues and all sorts of other issues, but there are also the failure to read the signs and make the adaptations and updates that are needed to stay ahead of the game. And I think that's also a big factor. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.